The morning sun, a pale and indifferent eye in the vast Michigan sky, did little to warm the old bones of Arthur P. Mitchell as he shuffled from his small, clapboard house to the rickety mailbox at the end of the gravel drive. This was the zenith of his day, this short, arduous journey. The crunch of gravel under his worn slippers was a familiar percussion to the symphony of his solitude, a sound so regular he could time his heartbeat by it. The house behind him, once filled with the boisterous chaos of a growing family, with the scent of his wife Eleanor's lavender perfume and her legendary Sunday pot roasts, was now a museum of silence, each room a carefully preserved exhibit of a life that had moved on without him. Eleanor was 5 years gone, claimed by a swift and merciless cancer, and his children, David and Sarah, were living full, vibrant lives on opposite coasts, their weekly phone calls kind but tinged with a distant, digital pity that Arthur could feel even through the fiber-optic cables. He retrieved the mail, a meager collection of utility bills and supermarket flyers, and turned back towards the house, his shoulders slumped not from the weight of the envelopes but from the crushing gravity of another identical day. He didn't notice the small, dark shape huddled and shivering beneath the skeletal branches of the old oak tree, not at first. It was just another piece of the landscape, another detail in the monotonous painting of his existence. But then the shape moved, a slight, pathetic tremor that caught the corner of his eye. Arthur paused, his hand on the cold metal of the screen door. He squinted, his old eyes struggling to focus. It was a dog, a small one, a tangled mess of black and white fur, so thin its ribs were a stark topography against its sides. It was staring at him with eyes that were not just brown, but pools of such profound and desperate sorrow that Arthur felt an unexpected, physical pang in his own hollow chest. The dog made no sound, didn't whine or bark. It just stared, as if it had used up all its capacity for noise and was now simply waiting, a silent supplicant at the edge of his world. Arthur's first instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, was to go inside, to close the door, to let the world and its problems remain outside where they belonged. He was too old for complications, too tired for the mess and the responsibility a creature like that would inevitably bring. But as he stood there, the memory of Eleanor's voice, soft and chiding, whispered in his mind, "Artie, you can't harden your heart. It's the one thing we must never do." He sighed, a long, ragged exhalation that fogged in the chilly air. "Shoo," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "Go on, now. Get." The dog didn't move. It just continued its silent, soulful observation. Muttering under his breath about foolish old men and their sentimental weaknesses, Arthur turned and went inside, firmly latching the screen door behind him. He tried to resume his routine, to pour his morning coffee, to sit in his worn armchair and stare at the morning news without seeing it, but the image of those eyes was burned onto the back of his eyelids. After an hour of futile internal debate, he found himself in the kitchen, scraping the leftover scraps of a days-old meatloaf onto a chipped plate. He carried it outside, moving with a gruff, performative reluctance. The dog was still there, shivering more violently now. Arthur placed the plate on the top step, a good 10 feet from the animal. "There," he grumbled. "Now, eat and be off with you." He retreated back inside, watching through the window. The dog approached with a heart-breaking caution, its body low to the ground, its tail tucked so far between its legs it was nearly invisible. It sniffed the food once, twice, then devoured it in 3 frantic, grateful gulps. When it was done, it looked back towards the house, not at Arthur, but at the door, as if offering a silent thank you, and then it turned and limped away, disappearing into the thicket of woods that bordered Arthur's property. Arthur felt a strange, conflicting sense of relief and disappointment. The problem had solved itself. Life could return to its quiet, predictable rhythm. But the next morning, the dog was back. And the next. Arthur, despite his grumbling, found himself preparing a plate each time. He started speaking to it, just short, gruff sentences. "You're back, then, or it's cold out. Don't you have any sense?" The dog never came closer, never made a sound. It was a silent, daily transaction. A week later, a vicious late winter storm descended, a howling gale that ripped shingles from roofs and drove sheets of freezing rain horizontally. Arthur sat by the fire, feeling the house groan around him, and he couldn't stop thinking about the little dog, out there in that maelstrom. The image of it, soaked and freezing, huddled under a bush, was more than he could bear. Eleanor's voice was in his ear again, louder this time. "Artie, for heaven's sake, he's just a little thing." With a curse that was more for his own softness than for the weather, Arthur pulled on his heavy coat and boots, grabbed an old horse blanket from the hall closet, and ventured out into the shrieking wind. He found the dog not under the oak tree, but pressed against the foundation of the house, seeking a sliver of shelter, a tiny, trembling, saturated scrap of life. It looked up at him, and for the first time, it let out a small, pitiful whimper. "All right, you fool animal," Arthur said, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "You win." He approached slowly, expecting the dog to bolt, but it didn't. It just watched him, its trust a fragile, newfound thing. He wrapped the coarse blanket around its shivering body and scooped it into his arms. It was shockingly light, a collection of bones and matted fur. He carried it into the house, into the warmth, and placed it on the rug before the fire. The dog stood there for a moment, dripping onto the hearth, then it turned in 3 slow circles and collapsed, heaving a sigh so deep and full of relief it seemed to come from the very center of its being. Arthur, for the first time in years, felt a corresponding sigh escape his own chest, a release of a tension he hadn't even known he was carrying. He named the dog Banjo, for no other reason than the name popped into his head and seemed to fit the scruffy, somehow musical little creature. The next few days were a delicate dance. Arthur, who had lived by a strict, self-imposed schedule for half a decade, found his rhythms disrupted. There were messes to clean, a diet to figure out, a trip to the vet, who declared Banjo, despite his condition, a surprisingly resilient terrier mix of about 2 years old, and miraculously, not microchipped. Arthur bought dog food, a collar, a leash, a ridiculously plush bed that Banjo immediately claimed with a contented grunt. The silence in the house began to recede, not with noise, for Banjo was still a quiet dog, but with presence. The soft pad of paws on hardwood, the rhythmic sound of his breathing as he slept by Arthur's chair, the gentle jingle of his tags, these became the new soundtrack of Arthur's life. And Arthur began to talk. He talked to Banjo about everything. He told him about Eleanor, about how they'd met at a county fair, about her laugh that could light up a room. He told him about David's first home run, about Sarah's obsession with horses, about the time he'd painted the entire house the wrong shade of yellow and Eleanor hadn't spoken to him for a week. He poured 5 years of pent-up stories into the patient, non-judgmental ears of the little dog, who would listen, his head cocked, his brown eyes fixed on Arthur's face as if every word was a precious gift. The walks to the mailbox became adventures. No longer a solitary trudge, they were now a slow, meandering exploration of the perimeter of Arthur's world. Banjo would sniff every blade of grass, investigate every fallen leaf, his tail, which had finally begun to uncurl and even wag on occasion, held high. Arthur found himself noticing things he hadn't seen in years. The first brave crocus pushing through the thawing earth, the particular way the light filtered through the pine trees in the late afternoon, the intricate architecture of a spider's web bejeweled with morning dew. Banjo had not just entered his life, he had given Arthur back his senses, had reconnected him to the physical world. One afternoon, about 2 months after Banjo's arrival, Arthur was in his workshop, a dusty shed behind the house where he used to build furniture but which now mostly housed ghosts and forgotten projects. He was looking for a specific screwdriver when his foot caught on a loose floorboard. He stumbled, his balance, never great these days, deserting him completely. He fell hard, his hip connecting with the concrete floor with a sickening, bony crack. A white-hot bolt of pain shot through his entire body, so intense it stole his breath. He lay there, gasping, the dust motes dancing in the slants of light, and a cold, familiar terror gripped him. This was it. This was how it would end. Alone, in a dusty shed, forgotten. He tried to push himself up, but the pain was too much. He was trapped. A low, despairing moan escaped his lips. And then he heard it. A frantic scratching at the workshop door, which he had closed behind him. A high, anxious whine, a sound he had never heard Banjo make before. Then, a bark. A single, sharp, surprisingly loud bark that cut through the pain-filled haze in Arthur's mind. It was followed by another, and another, a relentless, staccato alarm. "It's all right, Banjo," Arthur managed to croak out, but his voice was weak. The barking didn't stop. If anything, it became more insistent, more frantic. Banjo began to throw his small body against the bottom of the door, a futile but determined thumping. "He's going to hurt himself," Arthur thought with a surge of paternal concern that momentarily overshadowed his own agony. The barking continued for what felt like an eternity, a beacon of sound in the vast, empty silence of the property. And then, a miracle. A voice, young and uncertain, called out from the direction of the house. "Hello? Mr. Mitchell? Is everything all right?" It was Leo, the teenage boy from the next farm over who sometimes mowed Arthur's lawn in the summer. He was here to drop off a flyer for his spring cleanup service. He had heard the desperate, unceasing barking from the driveway and had been drawn to it. Arthur, with a Herculean effort, managed to shout, "In here! The workshop!" Leo found him, called an ambulance, and stayed with him until the paramedics arrived. As they loaded Arthur onto the gurney, he insisted they bring Banjo. "That dog," he told the young EMT, his voice thick with emotion, "that dog is my family." At the hospital, they confirmed a fractured hip. It was a serious injury for a man of his age, but the doctors were optimistic. His son David flew in, his face a mask of worry and guilt. "Dad, I'm so sorry. We should have been here, we should have," Arthur cut him off, his hand gripping his son's. "David, listen to me. I'm fine. A little dog with a big bark saw to that." He told David the whole story, from the shivering creature under the oak tree to the frantic barking that brought Leo to the shed. David looked at the scruffy little dog sitting patiently by his father's hospital bed, and for the first time, Arthur saw his son look at Banjo not as a pet, but as a savior. Recovery was slow and frustrating. Arthur was confined to a rehabilitation center for several weeks. The only condition he was adamant about was that Banjo could visit. And so, every other day, David would bring the little terrier to the rehab facility. Banjo would hop up onto Arthur's bed, careful of the injured hip, and curl up beside him, his mere presence a potent medicine. The nurses all adored him. He became the unofficial mascot of the wing, bringing a spark of life and unconditional love to the sterile, often depressing environment. Arthur, who had always been a private, somewhat stoic man, found himself smiling more, talking to the other patients, sharing the story of his unexpected bond with the dog who rescued him. When Arthur was finally discharged and returned home, the house felt different. It wasn't just a place to wait out the rest of his days, it was a home again, a shared space. He and Banjo settled into a new, even deeper rhythm. Their walks were slower now, Arthur leaning on a cane, Banjo matching his pace without a hint of impatience. They were a pair, a unit, a man and his dog, bound together by a debt that could never be repaid but was settled every day in 1,000 small ways, in a shared glance, in a warm weight against his legs at night, in the simple, profound joy of a wagging tail at the end of the gravel drive. The loneliness that had been Arthur's constant companion for half a decade had not just been held at bay, it had been vanquished, replaced by a bond that was as unexpected as it was unbreakable. He had set out to rescue a lonely, shivering dog, but in the end, he was the one who had been saved, pulled back from the brink of a cold and silent oblivion by 4 paws, a wet nose, and a heart full of unconditional love. The story of Arthur and Banjo became a local legend, a testament to the fact that sometimes, the most profound rescues are not of the body, but of the soul, and that a second chance can come in the most unexpected of forms, often with a wagging tail and eyes that see straight into the heart of your loneliness.